The Stand-In. A Sweet Romantic Comedy. By Maisie Morris. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. The Stand-In, copyright 2021 Maisie Morris. All rights reserved. Part 1. 3 days before my best friend Trixie's wedding, I got a frantic call from the bride-to-be. "I need you to be my maid of honor," she informed me. "Please do it, Shelby." I was in Little Rock, Trixie was in Dallas. She sounded more than a little frazzled. "What happened?" "Trina has developed preeclampsia," Trixie informed me. "She's on strict bed rest." Trina is Trixie's twin and was supposed to have been her matron of honor. Trina's baby wasn't due for weeks. "Is she okay?" "They think she's going to be fine, and so is the baby, but she's not up to being my matron of honor. She's not even going to be at the wedding." "Why me?" I asked. "You know I can't choose one of my other sisters," Trixie wailed on the other end of the line. I did know that. In addition to her twin and her brother, Dexter, Trixie has 2 other sisters, Reba and Rochelle. The Bradfords all love each other in their own rambunctious way, but the entire family fights like cats and dogs. Trixie's sisters had made their peace with Trixie choosing her twin to stand up for her, but whichever other sister Trixie didn't pick to be Trina's stand-in would never let it be forgotten that they'd been passed over. Reba and Rochelle aren't all that good at letting bygones be bygones. "What about Rick's sister?" I asked. "Rick is the groom." "I barely know the woman," Trixie protested. "I'm not even sure she likes me very much." "Please say you'll do it." "I don't know," I said. I wasn't even sure about being a bridesmaid. "Is this about Dexter?" It was about Dexter, but I wasn't about to admit it. Dexter was Rick's best man, largely on the merit that Dexter was the one who had introduced the happy couple to each other. I did not want to cling onto Dexter's arm and totter down the center aisle of St. Luke's Methodist Church in my unaccustomed heels, all the while wondering how many onlookers were speculating about our relationship. Given that plenty of the ones on the Bradford side probably remembered that there had been a brief period when Dexter and I had had eyes for only each other, this was not paranoia on my part. Even ignorance that Dexter and I had once been an item wouldn't be nearly enough to keep the whispers at bay. You get talked about a lot when you're a beanstalk. Stand next to any man who shops in Big and Tall, and all the old ladies start whispering to each other about how nice it is that she found someone her own size. "Of course, it's not about Dexter," I lied. "Good, then you'll have no problem being my maid of honor," said Trixie as if everything was settled. I decided I might as well give in. "Matron of honor," I said. "Are you sure it should be matron?" I wasn't sure. What was the protocol on whether a relatively recently divorced woman could be called the maid of honor? "Aunt Daffy will know," said Trixie. "It doesn't matter much anyway, the programs were printed up last week." Aunt Daffy, short for Daffodil, was Trixie's wedding coordinator. Daffodil Bradford Smith was a stickler for proper etiquette. I had a feeling that if I floated the idea of not having the maid/matron of honor walk down the aisle with the best man, Aunt Daffy wouldn't go for it. She'd also want to know why I was refusing to pair up with the best man, and that was a subject I was prepared to avoid at all costs. "You're still arriving at DFW at 10 tomorrow?" Trixie asked. "Yes," I said. "Are you sure Rick doesn't mind picking me up?" "I can get an Uber." Trixie said she was sure. I hadn't meant to set her off, but she was feeling sensitive about all the many duties that fell to the bride and how little was expected of the groom. She spent the next 10 minutes enumerating the inequities surrounding modern marriage. "The least Rick can do is make sure the members of the wedding party get picked up at the airport," Trixie said when she finally got back around to answering my original question. "Okay. I'll text him when I get my bag." Unfortunately, the following day when I texted Rick after hauling my bag off the luggage carousel at DFW, I got a text back saying he had been unavoidably detained and had sent a substitute. Who is picking me up? I think that should be whom. I like Rick. I think he and Trixie have as good a chance at a long and happy marriage as any other couple foolhardy enough to get gussied up in uncomfortable outfits and take that fateful walk down the aisle to the altar, but he frequently irritates the daylights out of me. Rick's a high school English teacher, and sometimes it shows. I decided to play along with Rick's grammar police tendencies and tried again. Whom is picking me up? Where are you waiting? Area 5 on the lower level. Stay there. Someone is coming. Who? Whom? Whom? I think you're right. It should be who. I gave up after that. I knew who was coming. There had to be a reason Rick didn't want to tell me, and I could think of only one. I'm not usually a girl for checking myself in the mirror every 10 minutes, but I hadn't even glanced at myself since I'd left my house 5 hours earlier. I rifled through my purse, hoping that I'd have spontaneously turned into the sort of woman who carries around a compact and lipstick. Alas, no lipstick fairy godmother had slipped any materials for an emergency touch-up into my bag, so I made do with a smear of cherry-flavored lip balm and a swipe at the inner corners of my eyes to be sure I wasn't sporting eye boogers. Because that's the sort of sophisticated and elegant creature I am. I waited 10 minutes and checked my phone for a text. I scanned the line of cars waiting along the curb. I waited another 10 minutes, then texted Rick. Still waiting. Be patient. You sent Dexter? Who Dexter? I think that should be who is Dexter. All I got back was a smiley face. Dexter has always been late. He was even born late. He stayed in his mother's womb so long that he was 13 pounds by the time he decided to get on with it and get born already. He's still big. That's what made his exit from Rick's Mini Cooper all the more comical. I hate that car, I'm closing in on 6 feet myself, and I avoid riding in it if I can. Hello, Shelby. Hello, Dexter. That all you got? Dexter pointed at my bag. I nodded. Good. How you been? Good. You? Good. We folded and wedged ourselves into our respective seats in Rick's ridiculous car and didn't say another word to each other the entire 20 minutes to Trixie's apartment in Carrollton. I tried not to look over at Dexter and pretty much succeeded, but I could tell from my powers of peripheral vision that he wasn't doing the same. I guess he was curious, after all, we hadn't seen each other in probably 4 years. Or it may have been that I'd missed an eye booger, and it was a fascination akin to horror. Sue, how is Dexter? Was the first thing Trixie said to me after she'd given me a hug on my arrival at the apartment she was about to give up to move into Rick's 4-bedroom house with a yard, a swimming pool, and a golden retriever named Bud. I didn't like Trixie broaching the subject of Dexter first thing. Clearly, she and Rick were cooking up something. I wouldn't have put it past them to have tricked Dexter into coming to get me by telling them he was picking up Grandma Bradford or somebody and then pulling a bait-and switch at the last minute. That's what they'd done to me. Dexter's good, I said. I think. What did you and Dexter talk about? When? On the way back from the airport. Nothing. Nothing? Nothing. You didn't catch up? Talk about old times? I wouldn't mind catching up with Dexter. I do wish him well. I hope he's having a good life. As for old times? Those I'd rather forget about. Trixie? I said. Yes. Can we give the whole Dexter thing a rest? Part 2. When I asked Trixie if we could give the whole Dexter thing a rest, she just stared back at me, completely unrepentant. I mean it, I said. We have nothing to say to each other, so. I think you do, said Trixie. And so does Rick. Shouldn't you two be concentrating on getting married to each other, not on someone else's non-existent relationship? Dexter and I were over, not that we ever were much, except for that short-lived engagement which I think we'd both rather chalk up to youthful impulse and forget ever happened. How can you say that? Trixie said. You know you two were meant for each other. That's what Dexter had said when he'd proposed 10 years ago. 3 days later, he'd taken it all back. I knew why, and I didn't blame him. I didn't blame him at all, but that didn't make me any more convinced that those words had even been true at the time. Dexter Bradford and I are not meant to be, I said with all the conviction that I could muster. I thought I'd been so convincing that I had shut Trixie up until she said, if you and Dexter got married, we could be sisters. Sisters are not the same thing as sisters-in-law, but I wasn't going to go all Aunt Daffy on anyone, so I just said, you already have 3 sisters. I know, but I just want you to be happy. I am happy. Are you? I am. Sort of. Not really. Well, Dexter isn't happy, said Trixie. Well, as I already pointed out, I'm no expert on what Dexter is or isn't. You know he asks about you all the time. I very much doubted that, but it was pointless to argue about what Dexter did or didn't do. You'd better let me try on my dress, I said, in case it needs to be altered. My clothes never fit quite right. Anything off the rack is always too short. This wasn't off the rack. The bride's party was being outfitted by some dressmaker friend of Aunt Daffy's who had taken detailed measurements over the phone. I tried on the dress, which was a lovely lilac color. For once, something fit. If I had to stand up in front of a crowd of Trixie and Rick's well-wishers for 45 minutes while trying to avoid meeting Dexter's big blue eyes as he towered over the groom and looked too good to be true, at least I could do it without reflexively tugging my hem down every 10 seconds. It's beautiful, I said. No, said Trixie, you're beautiful. I think that's what people are supposed to say to the bride. Don't deflect. I'm not deflecting. I was. I can't take a compliment. When's the rehearsal? I asked. In 2 hours. I'd expected to spend those 2 hours chowing down on potato chips while I listened to the bride-to-be enumerate the trials of getting hitched. It was not to be. 3 minutes after I'd gotten that lovely lilac dress off, Trixie's phone dinged. There's a problem at the church, she said. What kind of problem? Aunt Daffy forgot the candles, and she needs somebody to run them over. Candles? We have to practice lighting the unity candle. Do you need the real thing for that? Apparently, the real thing was essential to a proper rehearsal, at least according to Aunt Daffy. I was dispatched in Trixie's old Honda to pick up the candles from the mother of the bride's house and make sure they arrived at the church before the rest of the wedding party. I could only imagine the disorder when everyone descended to mill around and chatter instead of waiting in an orderly manner to be told where and when to stand, where and when to walk, and when to sit down and shut up. I had no idea what Rick's family was like, but getting the Bradford family to follow instructions was going to be like herding cats. I felt for Aunt Daffy. I really did. And it didn't bode well that she was already freaking out about a couple of missing candles. Are you wearing that? Trixie asked as I was halfway out her front door. I looked down at my jeans and oversized sweater. What's wrong with it? There's nothing wrong with it, Trixie told me. It's just that you might want to practice in your heels. I hate heels. I don't know why Trixie made such a big deal about the bridal party wearing them, but I wasn't about to cross her just before the rehearsal, so I opened my suitcase and pulled out the heels I'd bought just for this occasion. I'll take them with me, I said. You should wear them, said Trixie. Why? Trixie just raised an eyebrow at me. Fine, I said. I know I need the practice, but don't blame me if you have to get a substitute for the second-string matron of honor when I break my ankle and can't make it down the aisle at all. Breaking an ankle was sounding better and better. I wouldn't even have to break it. Just a bad sprain would be enough to get me out of the whole thing. I pictured myself sitting serenely in the third pew back as I rubbed my faintly throbbing ankle, smiling sweetly at the happy couple as they stood at the altar without me. That sounded like heaven in comparison to what I was about to put myself through. Trixie was staring at me. I must have had a weird smile on my face or something. I don't care if Dexter has to push you down the aisle in a wheelchair or carry you in on his back, said Trixie. You are not flaking out on being my maid of honor. Trixie knows me too well. Fine. I held up the heels. I'll put these on at the church. I sure wasn't going to attempt to drive in the horrible things. Wait. Trixie commanded and returned from her bedroom with a red, figure-hugging dress on a hanger. Wear this. I wasn't going to wear that. On Trixie, that dress was sassy but tasteful, and the hem probably fell a few inches above the knee. I could probably fit into that dress, but it would be a micro-mini. No, I said. Why not? I think your Aunt Daffy has enough worries on her mind without wondering when the matron of honor is going to flash everyone. You wouldn't flash anyone, Trixie insisted, but I think even she could see reason. Aunt Daffy probably didn't approve of that dress, even on Trixie. I'm not here to impress anyone, I said, or scandalize them. Suit yourself, said Trixie, but at least put on some lipstick. I hate lipstick, I said. I do hate lipstick, although if I were trying to impress anyone, lipstick always helps. I left with the heels in my hand and sans lipstick. As soon as I got to Mr. and Mrs. Bradford's house, I knew I'd been set up once again. Or, to be more accurate, Dexter and I both had. I seriously doubted it had been Dexter's idea to stand waiting out by the Bradfords' mailbox holding a large white pillar unity candle festooned with a giant purple bow and 2 lavender tapers. I can take the candles, I said when I popped out of the driver's side at the curb. You could, said Dexter, but the bride insists that I see to the matter myself. I could have opted to let Dexter drive Trixie's Honda to the church and stayed behind with their mother at the Bradfords until it was time for rehearsal, but the last time I'd been alone with Mrs. Bradford had been 10 years ago. Patricia Bradford had patted my back and handed me tissues while I cried my little eyes out because her only son had abruptly broken our engagement. Somehow, in comparison, being cooped up with Dexter in a car for 10 minutes on the way to the church didn't seem so bad. I don't get the whole unity candle thing, said Dexter as I pulled away from the curb. I didn't really get the whole unity candle thing either. When Todd and I got married, I nixed the candle lighting portion of the service in the bud. Ditto the throwing of the garter and the bouquet. Tall girls hate the throwing of the bouquet. I caught the bouquet 5 weddings in a row once. I didn't even have a boyfriend. Maybe that's why Todd and I didn't even last 2 years. It must have been because we failed to light a unity candle together and opted not to put our single friends through a humiliating competition for a cheap garter and a bunch of overpriced flowers. The failure of our marriage certainly couldn't have had anything to do with the fact that Todd was a lying, cheating scumbag with a festering pustule where his heart should have been. But I digress. Unity candles are overrated, I said. There was a long silence before Dexter said, I'm sorry about you and Todd. I'm not. I wasn't sorry about Todd, anyway. I was still feeling a little sorry for myself. You deserve someone better, said Dexter. Everyone says that. If I had $1 for every person who'd said those words to me after I'd finally shown my ex-husband the door, I wouldn't need that crummy job in customer service I'd taken to support Todd when he'd gone back to school for his master's degree. It was supposed to be a temporary thing until he finished, and it was my turn to go back to school. Now I had no husband and no master's degree, just a crummy job that consisted of listening to people tell me all the ways their non-working refrigerator had ruined their lives, the lives of subsequent generations, and the very future of humankind. I do deserve someone better, I said. I won't argue with that. There was another long silence, but just as I was slowing for a red light at an intersection, Dexter said, You know I've never quite fallen out of love with you. Part 3. When Dexter told me he'd never really fallen out of love with me, I slammed on the brakes so hard that we nearly got rear-ended. When the honking had died down and I'd crept up to the light, I waited until my hands had stopped shaking before I asked, Why are you telling me this? I just thought you might like to know. I wasn't sure I did want to know. You don't have to feel guilty about what happened, I said. I've never held it against you. That was the truth. At the time, Dexter had lied about his reason for calling off our engagement. He'd come off as a first-class jerk, but he'd made what he believed was a selfless decision in my best interest. Dexter had broken my heart, but that had never been his intention. I'd been livid with him at the time, but when I'd found out why he'd reneged on his proposal, everything had made a lot more sense. It hadn't hurt any less when I understood his reasons, but I couldn't hate him for it. Looking back on it now, I would definitely have done things differently, said Dexter, but I don't feel guilty about it. I did the best I knew how. I was just immature and listened to bad advice. I couldn't argue with that. We'd both been immature and listened to bad advice. This has nothing to do with me feeling guilty, said Dexter. That's not why. We're here, I said. Better get those candles inside before poor Aunt Daffy has a meltdown. I doubt Aunt Daffy has ever had a meltdown in her life, said Dexter. Well, let's not be the reason she has her first one. Rehearsal was torture. I sat in a pew on the front row between Dexter and Sam, another of Rick's groomsmen. There were about 10 people sitting in a space designed to fit 8, and it was a choice between being uncomfortably close to Dexter or being uncomfortably close to Sam. I'd already noted that Sam had a wandering eye, and he'd introduced himself to me by making an impertinent remark about the possibility of undue friendliness between groomsmen and bridesmaids being a wedding tradition. I don't think Dexter even heard Sam's offhand proposition, but I could feel Dexter glaring at Sam over the top of my head as soon as the other groomsman shoehorned his way into the pew on the other side of me. I scooched up closer to Dexter and tried to make myself smaller by folding my hands over my crossed knees. Dexter put his arm around the back of the pew, which should have freed up some room, but didn't. The only thing it accomplished was to make it look like he had his arm around me even though he let it hang off the back of the pew, so it wasn't touching me at all. I could feel every breath Dexter took, and I was far from convinced that he wouldn't detect the erratic beating of my runaway heart. I finally leaned forward in my seat, partly to minimize body contact and partly because I remembered that I needed to change into the heels still sitting in the shoebox under the pew. When I went to untie my shoelaces, my fingers were shaking so bad I had trouble getting the double knot undone. "Let me help you," said Dexter as he leaned down, his eyes directed toward the floor, but his face just inches from mine. "It's okay," I said, "I've got it." Except I didn't have it. I was a mess, and Dexter knew it. I struggled with the knot for a few more seconds until I gave up. Dexter leaned across me to get to my feet, and I hastily pulled my hands out of my lap, only to find that I didn't know what to do with them. My first impulse was to thrust my hands up in the air like I was the victim of an armed robbery, but I decided that would bring far too much attention to myself, so I folded my hands together and let them hover demurely a few millimeters above Dexter's broad back, elbows akimbo like a belly dancer gearing up to do a shimmy. I was trying to pay attention to Aunt Daffy's instructions about going out to the foyer and lining up to practice walking in, but I was having trouble concentrating. Dexter had pulled off both of my tennis shoes and was starting to pull at the toe of one of my socks. "I can do that," I hissed, but he didn't seem to hear me. I nudged up with my knee, but he just kept pulling at my sock. Dexter had just gotten my second sock off and was taking one of my heels from the box when I realized that Sam had gotten up and the entire front pew was migrating to the back of the sanctuary. By the time Dexter had taken the second heel from the shoebox, Aunt Daffy was standing over us. "Sorry, Aunt Daffy," Dexter said a split second before sitting up so quickly the back of his head whacked me right in the nose. It wasn't until I bent over to put on my remaining heel, and I saw a drop of red splatter onto the patent leather, that I realized I was bleeding. "Arg," I said, clutching my nose and returning to an upright position. "You're bleeding," Dexter said. "Umph. What I meant was, don't talk so loud, and for Pete's sake, go get me a tissue before I bleed all over the place." For some reason, whenever something like this happens, my instinct is to close my eyes. Perhaps it's a holdover from toddler logic. If I can't see everyone staring at me, it's as if they aren't. Tip your head back, I heard Trixie's voice, followed by an admonition to Dexter to stop standing there like an imbecile and go get the poor girl some tissue. I tipped my head back, and a second later, someone must have shoved a wad of tissues at Dexter because I heard him say, "Thanks," and felt his hand on the back of my head while his other hand nudged mine out of the way and pressed a neatly folded tissue under my nose. "She's fine," I heard Aunt Daffy saying. I think what she wanted to say was stop staring at the bleeding matron of honor and get on with the rehearsal, but she's too polite to put things quite that bluntly. It was shortly after that I made the mistake of opening my eyes. Dexter was leaning over me, his hand still cradling the back of my head. If I'd had only the look on his face to go by, I'd have believed I was about to expire on the spot. I could see the headline. Matron of Honor dies of nosebleed during wedding rehearsal. Authorities suspect best man to blame. I'd read that news story. I'm so sorry, Shelby. You okay? I'd be a lot more okay if Dexter would break eye contact. I should have looked away myself, but I couldn't. Dexter was looking at me like he really was still half in love with me. I didn't need that. I didn't love him back. I was fond of Dexter. Dexter was a good man. I respected him. Fondness and respect are not the same as love. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I tried not to dissect why a man I felt nothing but fondness and respect for was making my heart pound and my stomach flip just by cradling my head in his hand and pressing a tissue to my bleeding nose. It had nothing to do with the look in those big blue eyes of his. It couldn't. I wouldn't let it. I've got this, I said, finally finding the strength to wrench myself away, kick off my heels and flee, barefoot, to the church bathroom. 10 minutes later, when the bleeding had stopped, and I'd gotten most of the blood off my face, I skulked back out to the lobby where Dexter was waiting for me with my heels in his hand. "Are you sure it's stopped bleeding?" he said as he peered at my face and set the heels down in front of me. As I stepped into the shoes, I wobbled a little, and Dexter reached out to steady me by holding my forearm. "I hope so," I said. "Where are the others?" "Down front." Dexter let go of my arm and let me wobble down the aisle to take my place at the front under my own power, but when we got to the steps at the front of the church, he put his hand on the small of my back as I tottered up the steps. I didn't like the way the bride and groom broke off in the middle of the practice recitation of their wedding vows to smirk at us. As we exited the sanctuary in proper formation, I threaded my hand through Dexter's proffered elbow, just as Aunt Daffy had instructed us. What Aunt Daffy had not asked for was Dexter reaching over with his free hand and covering mine as I rested it lightly in the crook of his elbow. Rehearsal dinner was even more confusing. I drove Dexter and his sisters, Reba and Rochelle, to the restaurant in Trixie's little Honda. The three Bradfords kept up a patter of conversation the whole way, leaving me free to drive and try to sort out my tangle of feelings. Unfortunately, when we arrived at the restaurant, my feelings were more tangled than ever, and Reba and Rochelle essentially herded Dexter and me into the only 2 free seats left together at the table. It seemed that Trixie and Rick were not the only ones who'd gotten on board the Get Dexter and Shelby Back Together bandwagon. Dexter and I were seated between one of the uncles and Grandma Bradford, both of whom seemed to be laboring under the delusion that Dexter and I were back together. Dexter didn't set them straight, so it seemed rude for me to say anything either. "When are you two going to start having babies?" Grandma Bradford asked me halfway through the main course. Part 4. When Dexter's grandmother asked when we were going to start having babies, I nearly spit out a mouthful of lasagna. Instead, I aspirated a bit of it. "We haven't talked about that," Dexter told his grandmother while I gulped down water, and he rubbed the spot between my shoulder blades. "We had talked about having babies, but that was 10 years ago." "Well, don't leave it too long," said Grandma Bradford as if considering the breakdown of the polar ice caps or the possibility of nuclear winter. "How's your knee?" Dexter asked Grandma Bradford, which set her off in an entirely different direction. Why does everyone think we're back together? I whispered to Dexter when the relatives on either side of us were distracted. I'm not sure. Should I tell them we aren't? Don't they know I just got divorced? Hasn't it been almost a year? 11 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Not that anyone is counting. Doesn't anyone care? I asked Dexter. About your divorce? Yes. They know it wasn't your fault. Divorces are almost never the fault of only one person. Assigning blame accomplishes nothing. I was only pretending to take the high road. Dexter was right. If I were to blame for anything, it was for being a very poor judge of character. I might just be a bad picker when it came to men, although if Dexter and I had gotten married 10 years ago, I was pretty sure we'd still be together. I'd have finished school. We'd probably have a couple of kids. If Dexter and I had married each other, we'd likely both be in a much better place, but there was no sense in crying over spilled milk. What I mean is my family was happy about your divorce, Dexter said. Happy? I don't mean happy. What do you mean? Dexter was floundering, and he knew it. I looked across the table and caught Dexter's mother watching us. Dexter was right. Her face didn't say, "Don't you dare let that divorcee into the family." Judging by the look on her face, Mrs. Bradford's main worry was that I was going to break her son's heart. Again. Not that I'd ever had any intention of breaking Dexter's heart. I just hadn't had a clue what he was going through. Dexter and I didn't say another word to each other until dessert arrived. I hope we're not all putting you in a bad spot, Dexter said as I pronged a forkful of tiramisu. You aren't already seeing someone else? I wasn't, but I was tempted to let him sweat a little while I finished my mouthful. It's not like that, I said. We need to talk. We are talking. You know what I mean. I did know what he meant, but I was too tired for that conversation. I needed a good night's sleep to clear my system of the cocktail of happy hormones that got topped up every time Dexter's elbow brushed against my sleeve or I met his gaze. I wasn't still in love with Dexter. When I'd married Todd, I hadn't been thinking of any other man. I'd genuinely loved my ex-husband, not that he'd deserved it. I wasn't still in love with Dexter, but I was halfway to falling in love with him all over again. The morning of the wedding, I woke up so late I had to go to the church without even brushing my hair. Trixie insisted that this did not matter. Aunt Daffy had arranged for a team of hair and makeup artists to make sure that the female members of the wedding party looked their best. Don't let them make me look ridiculous, I told Trixie. I thought it was the maid of honor's job to look after the bride, not the other way around. Matron of honor. Are you sure? Trixie asked. No, I forgot to consult with Aunt Daffy. Nobody is going to make you look ridiculous. I hoped Trixie was right. When we got to the church, and I was assigned to an incredibly young woman with pink hair and a nose ring, I worried a little less. I might end up looking nothing like myself, but I probably wouldn't be styled to resemble a prematurely aged debutante with helmet hair and fake lashes. Miss Nose Ring did give me lash extensions, but when she handed me the mirror to look at myself, I wasn't complaining. I still looked like me, only better. I told you there was nothing to worry about, Trixie said after the hair and makeup team had departed, and I was helping her do up the million buttons on the back of her dress. I wasn't worried. You were. I was still worried. The source of my anxiety was just no longer whether I'd have to traipse down the aisle looking like a Mrs. Texas BBQ contender taking part in the formalwear competition for the 30 and up division. Is your whole family rooting for Dexter and me to get back together? I asked as I hooked the little fastener at the back of Trixie's bridal gown. Yes. There was not a trace of hesitation in her voice. I'm scared. Of what? What if we hurt each other all over again? You won't. How can you be so sure? I can't. I think Trixie would have had more to say on the subject, she'd clearly given it a great deal of thought, but just then, Aunt Daffy came in and told us that it was time for everyone but the bride to get in line out in the foyer. "Thank you for being my maid of honor," said Trixie. "I'd hug you, but we'd both wrinkle." I don't think Trixie was worried about wrinkles. If she hugged me, we'd both start crying, and that would ruin all of Miss Nose Ring's hard work before anyone even got a chance to see what beautiful creatures she'd transformed us into. When I went out to the foyer and lined up next to Dexter, he didn't comment on my appearance, but he couldn't stop staring at me. "I know," I said. "I look weird with makeup." "I wouldn't say weird." Dexter and I met when he was 12 and I was 10, just after I'd become instant best friends with his sister, Trixie. All those years, even during the time where we'd gone from friends to more than friends and then gotten engaged, Dexter had never once told me that I was beautiful. That's not Dexter's style. Or at least it didn't used to be. "You look beautiful, Shelby," he said and grabbed my hand. I thought he was going to put it through the crook of his elbow, per Aunt Daffy's express instructions, but he didn't. He held it like he used to, with his fingers laced through mine and his thumb making little circles on the back of my hand. Part of me wanted to pull my hand away, and part of me wanted him to never let it go. He did let my hand go when Aunt Daffy went down the line like a refined drill sergeant partial to rose scent and pearl necklaces inspecting new recruits. "You all right?" Dexter asked as I swayed in my high heels and latched onto his arm a little tighter. "I feel slightly ridiculous," I said. "Why is all this necessary?" "It isn't," said Dexter. "When you get married again, you can order everyone to show up in jeans and funny hats if it suits you. The bride calls the shots." In reality, it's often the bride's mother who calls the shots, but I didn't point that out. "Who says I'm ever getting married again?" "Aren't you?" "Who knows?" I said. "After what happened last time." About that, Dexter started to say, but he had to shut up because Aunt Daffy was waving her clipboard at us and motioning for us to get ourselves down the aisle. All during the ceremony, I tried not to look over at Dexter, but every time I accidentally did, he was looking at me. He didn't even look away when he knew I knew he was watching me. It was very unnerving. It was so unnerving that when the time came to take Trixie's bouquet so she could exchange rings with Rick, Reba, who was standing beside me, had to give me a little dig in the ribs. I barely registered it, but it seemed that over on the groom's side, there'd also been a delay in the best man producing the rings. Dexter and I weren't paying attention to anyone but each other, and I was quite sure lots of people had noticed. The reception was no better. Normally, the matron of honor and the best man would flank the happy couple, but that's not how things had been arranged. Dexter and I were sitting together. "Are you nervous about giving the toast?" Dexter said when we'd finally sat down at the table, and the most gregarious of the Bradford cousins was hyping it up at the mic. Part 5. The toast. I'd forgotten all about writing a toast. I'd been to at least 100 weddings. I knew that the matron of honor was expected to make a toast. My panic must have been showing on my face because Dexter took my hand under the table and dug into the pocket of his tux with the other. He took out a stack of index cards and a pen. He kept the first 3, which had his own speech written on them, and handed me the rest. "You can do it right now," he said. "It'll be fine. I'll help you." My mind went blank. All I could concentrate on was Dexter's thumb making soothing little circles on the palm of my hand. At least, I think he intended it to be soothing. Unfortunately, it was having the opposite effect. "Can I read yours?" I asked, hoping that reading words on a page would stop the thoughts buzzing around inside my head like a hive of angry bees. "Sure." Dexter laid the cards down on the table, and I picked them up with my free hand to read them. It was a good speech. Funny. Heartfelt. Short. Short was good. And I could do heartfelt. Funny might be a stretch. "Just say what you feel," Dexter said. What I felt right now had little to do with the bride or the groom, and while the wedding guests might find my complicated feelings for Dexter fascinating, A tell-all wasn't what was called for. Start with a joke, Dexter suggested. I'm bad at jokes. It doesn't have to be a joke, said Dexter. You and Trixie have been friends forever. You've got to have an embarrassing story or two to tell. I had plenty of embarrassing stories. I wasn't going to tell them. I finally settled on a cute anecdote about how Trixie and I made a pact in 7th grade that we'd never marry anyone the other didn't approve of. Come to think of it, Trixie hadn't approved of Todd. I should have taken her misgivings more seriously. However, I did approve of Rick, so finishing that story of our naive teenage pact still had a feel-good ending as long as I didn't bring up my own sad love life. Then I wrote down a few things I liked about Trixie and Rick as a couple, and I was done. It hadn't been hard, but that was mostly because Dexter had been sitting there holding my hand under the table and making helpful suggestions and telling me what I came up with was good. Was that what being married to Dexter would have been like? No competition, just cooperation. No one-upmanship. No keeping score. It probably would have been like that. Dexter was nothing like Todd. Dexter would never have pressured me to drop out of school. He'd never have made me feel like I wasn't enough. He'd never have taken everything I had to give and grudgingly doled out crumbs of consideration and support in return. Dexter would never have cheated on me and then tried to make me believe that his infidelity was somehow my fault. Have you had anything to eat since you got up this morning? Dexter asked. I'd meant to have something while we were getting our hair and makeup done. There had been a breakfast spread at the church, but somehow, I'd gotten around to only a cup of coffee and half a Danish. You're shaky, said Dexter. I'll get you something. I was far from convinced that it was a simple case of low blood sugar that was giving me the shakes, but Dexter was already halfway to the buffet, and 3 minutes later, he was back with a plate. Nobody's eating yet, I protested. I can't. It's not a good look if the maid of honor faints. Nobody's fainting. I was feeling a little lightheaded, but that was mostly from the way Dexter was sitting with his whole body angled toward me, his legs pressing against mine. He lowered the plate down so it was no longer visible to anyone but the two of us. The crab puffs look good, he said. They did look good. I leaned down to have a closer look. They smelled good, too. Dexter picked a crab puff up off the plate. Open your mouth, he said. It was just as he'd popped the crab puff into my open mouth, and I was righting myself, that I heard Aunt Daffy behind us clearing her throat. I didn't know it was possible to clear one's throat in a refined manner, but Aunt Daffy somehow managed to pull it off. Do you both have your speeches ready? Aunt Daffy asked. Dexter said he did. I said, UMaff, or something to that effect. Crab puff, said Dexter. She's eating a crab puff. Of course, said Aunt Daffy as if it had never occurred to her to wonder what I'd been doing with my head under the table. It'll be fine, said Dexter. Shelby wrote a beautiful toast. We'd written a beautiful toast. I just hoped when the time came to deliver it, I didn't cry or faint or start laughing hysterically. As it turned out, I didn't do any of those things. Fortified with crab puffs and an enormous chunk of peanut butter fudge Dexter had filched off the dessert table, I managed to impersonate a sane and reasonably poised person. Everyone laughed in the places I'd wanted them to, and I reduced the bride to tears. Normally, reducing your best friend to tears is not a good thing, but in this case, it meant I'd made a good toast. After we'd finished our dinners, the bride and her father had had their first dance, and Rick and Trixie were inviting everyone out onto the dance floor. Dexter said, I know you don't like to dance. That was not entirely true. I love to dance. Just not in public. And definitely not in heels. How about we go out for a little fresh air? I suggested. The reception venue was on a small lake, and out the back of the dining room, there was a long veranda overlooking the water. A few people had wandered out to look at the lake, but we had one end of the deck to ourselves. I'm kind of glad we cleared the air between us, I said. Me, too, said Dexter, but there are still some things I'd like to say. I waited for him to say them, but he just stared off across the water. I was standing so close to Dexter that I could have reached out and traced the long scars across the back of his head that were hidden by his hair. I had lots of questions about those scars, but I'd never had the nerve to ask for the details directly from him. I might get sick again, Dexter finally said. There's no such thing as recovering from cancer. All you ever really are is in remission. I know that, I said. Cancer is a scary word, but it wasn't nearly as scary to me now as it had been at 21. I don't think about it all the time anymore, though, said Dexter. I was sure he meant he no longer constantly worried about coming out of remission. That's good, I said. You know what I do think about? Dexter had been looking over the water, but now he turned toward me and took a step closer. I've never been able to stop wondering what would have happened if I'd just told you the truth. We'd have gotten married. That's what would have happened. I'd have supported him through the surgery to remove that ugly tumor. I'd have watched him lose his hair and 30 pounds from chemo. I'd have held his hand, and we'd both have pretended we weren't scared to death. But none of that had happened. By the time I'd known about the ugly tumor and the surgery and the chemo, Dexter had been nearly recovered. You should have told me, I said. I know that now. Truthfully, I couldn't believe how Trixie had managed to conceal her brother's illness from me. True, right after our broken engagement, I'd gotten an acceptance letter from the graduate school of my choice. I'd taken off and left my old life behind, but it was still a testament to the Bradfords' sense of family loyalty that they'd all respected Dexter's wishes to keep his illness from me, even though I now knew that Trixie had believed her brother was doing the wrong thing all along. By the time I'd found out why Dexter had abruptly decided our whole relationship was a mistake, it had been an entire year since he'd put an engagement ring on my finger. I'd been devastated when I'd found out about Dexter's illness. I'd been angry, too, but knowing what he'd been going through had taken most of the remaining sting out of the way Dexter had suddenly rejected me just days after asking me to spend the rest of my life with him. We were both very young, I said. We handled things badly, but we both did the best we knew how. That doesn't change how much I hurt you. It didn't. But he had hurt, too. After he'd recovered from chemo, he'd reached out to me, but I was too hurt and angry to give him another chance. I've forgiven you, I said. I understand why you did what you did. We can leave it in the past. And then what? What do you mean? We can move on. Together or separately? Part 6. When Dexter asked if I meant to move on together or separately, he was laying all his cards on the table. Do I have to give you an answer right now? I asked. No. There was a long, awkward pause. I kicked off my shoes and leaned over the railing to look at the water skaters making little trails on the surface of the lake. Trixie said you moved away from Chicago recently, I said. But every time I ask where you've moved to, she gets cagey. There's a reason for that. Oh. I got transferred to Little Rock about 6 months ago. What? Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to put any pressure on you. You'd just gotten divorced and... Dexter trailed off. He was right. 6 months ago, if I'd found out he'd moved to Little Rock, and he'd tried to reach out, I would have felt pressured. I didn't now. Dexter living in the same town was the best news I'd heard in ages. Can we start over? I said. From the beginning? From the beginning. Fine, said Dexter, but don't get mad if I hide a plastic spider in your shoe. He'd actually done that. He'd also talked me down out of a tree I'd been foolhardy enough to climb, and he'd saved me the grape popsicles out of the variety packs his mother bought because he knew they were my favorite flavor. Bottom line, Dexter had always been a nice guy if one discounted the odd plastic spider. I don't think we need to rewind to the plastic spider era, I said. How far back do you want to go? How about the first time you kissed me? The first time I kissed you was in our treehouse. I'd forgotten all about that. Dexter had lost in a game of truth or dare to Reba, who dared him to kiss me. It had been my first kiss, and 11-year-old me had decided, based on that awkward experience, that kissing was highly overrated. Yes, our teeth knocked together, I said. You really want to relive that moment? Not really, how about the second time? That time you kissed me, Dexter said. I racked my brain. When was that? The state fair. I never kissed you at the state fair. Yes, you did. I pretended to pass out behind the goat shed, and you were so scared you tried to give me mouth to mouth. That doesn't count, I insisted. Well, this does, said Dexter. Dexter wrapped one hand around the back of my neck and the other around my waist. He leaned in until his mouth was almost on mine. My eyes fluttered closed, and I could feel the heat radiating off his body. Are you sure about this? Dexter whispered in my ear. Absolutely sure, I whispered back. His lips were soft and warm, and I was kissing him back when we were interrupted by whoops and hollers. I turned around in Dexter's arms to see the entire Bradford clan crowded out onto the deck. Even Aunt Daffy was ogling us. I knew it, was all Trixie had to say. My first instinct was to bolt, but Dexter held on to me, and we stayed out on the deck mingling with the Bradfords, who, as it had turned out, had decided to assemble for a family group picture before the light went. When it came time to arrange ourselves for the photographer, I tried to slip away, but Dexter wouldn't let me. I'm not a Bradford, I protested. Shelby's staying in the picture, the mother of the bride insisted. You do know what Mom's been calling you all these years, said Trixie. I could think of any number of things Mrs. Bradford might have elected to call me after I'd refused to take the calls of her son, who'd just gone into remission and wanted to get on with his life by rekindling his romance with the woman he believed was the love of his life. I'd done that, but I wasn't proud of it. In the Bradford family, Trixie continued, Shelby is known as the one that got away. Well, she isn't getting away a second time, is she? Said Mrs. Bradford. I didn't want to get away. I wanted to stay. I wanted to become a part of the rambunctious Christmases and birthdays and camping trips, but mostly I wanted Dexter. Not because he was a Bradford, but because he was right for me. At least, I believed he was, and I knew he'd give me all the time I needed to find out if we really truly were meant for each other before he asked me one last time to become Mrs. Dexter Bradford. The end.